Hi there, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm David Harvey, and I'm here with my co-host John Andrews. The two of us from two different countries are here for the second time this week to talk to you about another text from our Miracles season. And this today is episode 6, and it's called They Were Both Daughters.
Well, hi David, it is wonderful to be back again, and we are dipping into our second part of Mark chapter 5. Wow, we had a blast thinking about Legion and Jesus delivering this man and this incredible story in the early part of Mark chapter 5. And we're sort of going to lean into the second part of that, having looked in our previous episode, this man's story. We're now going to look at two stories involving women, an older woman and a younger woman, and hopefully complete this incredible reflection on chapter 5. So shall I hand it over to you, and you can read for us from Mark chapter 5 from around about, is it 20, verse 22 onwards, I think? We're going to read.
Yeah, let's begin Mark 21, just cross over from our last episode, actually. Jesus has been doing a chunk of sailing in Mark chapter 4 and 5. And as we pointed out in the last episode, they're basically just sailing back and forward across the same bit of the sea. So yeah, verse 21 of Mark 5, so Jesus crossed again in the boat to the other side. A great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. So it's quite interesting. You've got the contrast, actually, from our last episode that Jesus has been ejected from the region he was in. By the time he gets back to cross to the other side, closer to home now, there's a big crowd waiting for him. So let's pick this up from verse 22 then, John. It's one of... Somebody's going to send you an email one day and say, David says this about every verse that he reads, but one of my favorites. Well, actually, and I'll tell you this, John, just out of interest, well, maybe it's not of interest. The reason this passage is one of my personal favorites goes back to my first year in seminary when I was learning Greek. And this passage of Mark's Gospel is the first time in my life that I was looking at a text in the original language and saw things I'd never seen before. And I remember sitting with my Greek text. It was hard work for me because I was still learning it, but I saw some things, and I remember thinking, I've got to get better at this because this is amazing. And so there's a deep personal sense for this story for me that when it was one of my first kind of deep dives into Scripture. So beautiful. With that little bit of autobiography over, let's go into the actual brilliance of the text. So then, verse 22 of Mark 5, then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately, aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." But while he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. And then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement, and he strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and he told them to give her something to eat.
Come on. Give her
What a
something
great
to
story.
eat.
It's just
Oh,
brilliant.
it's beautiful.
Don't forget, if you're ever raised from the dead, have a snack.
Eat something. Eat something. Absolutely. Make it healthy, though. Make it healthy. But yeah, absolutely. Even as you read that, I moved. Do you know, I've been raised in church. I've been a follower of Jesus consciously as a follower since I was 8 years old. And hearing those two stories read again, I am just moved with the compassion of Jesus, and also the sense of need that's felt. The story of the woman, you get the overwhelming sense of her need, her brokenness, her desperation, and how Jesus ultimately is tender towards that, even though he's a bystander to begin with. And then this gorgeous, no, I'm gonna get to Jairus' house and we are gonna raise this girl. I just love, I just love the Jesus I see in that, David. We're gonna dig in and get a bit more, but you know what? This is gorgeous. It's absolutely beautiful. Yeah.
And so we probably spend most of this episode talking about how much we just love all of the little things in this text. So big contrast just for a second. Going back to our previous episode, we had a Gentile man oppressed by an impure spirit in a Gentile region hanging out in the tombs. They crossed the lake, and now we have a synagogue leader. So a man of some societal influence, a man of some social status, a Jewish man in a Jewish region in a very Jewish job, right? For want of a term. Like, notice the contrast that Mark is just drawing for us here.
Beautiful.
The Jesus who goes to this man is also the Jesus who comes to this man. And just in case you don't get that, we're going to insert into the middle of this story a marginalized poor person once again. And of course, just I've been reading a really fascinating book of late by Matthew Thiessen. He wrote a book called Jesus and the Forces of Death. And it's really interesting because he looks through a lot of these stories in Mark chapter 5. And one of the things he notices is that between the story of our last episode about the demoniac in the Gerasenes, and then Jairus' daughter, and then this woman, ritual impurity is a thread through all of them. It's an impure spirit. The daughter turns up dead, so it's a corpse. The woman has this 12-year-long hemorrhage, which would be an abnormal sort of bodily emission, therefore creating permanent ritual impurity. So there's something going on. We might want to come back to that at some point, but there's also a thread. So there's a thread between the status of the people fluctuating, but there's also a thread of them all navigating perceptions of what would be called ritual impurity.
Yeah, really good. And I think actually Jairus himself is a great sort of jolting of that idea. So we've left the impurity into purity context of the Decapolis. And of course, it's interesting it describes Jairus as a synagogue ruler. And there is a suggestion, David, that synagogue rulers may have been lay people, but also you may have had local Pharisees leading. Now, that would be an interesting one into our little sort of Jesus and Pharisee conversation. Yes. If Jairus is a Pharisee, and it's a big if, and we don't want to build our house on silence here, but if Jairus is a Pharisee, then you've got a very, very interesting moment. So you've got this unclean, impure spirit in the early part of 5. And then you've got this man absolutely, if he is a Pharisee, committed to absolute purity. I mean, Pharisee means separated one. But of course, if he is a Pharisee, not just the synagogue ruler, then falling at the feet of Jesus, something big going on there. I catch the spirit there of Nicodemus coming to Jesus in John 3. Yeah. We know. We know you're a man sent from God. There was a bunch of them, you, and for one reason or another, weren't always coming out in public. Here's Jairus, forced by pure, unadulterated desperation. Right, okay. If this guy can do half the stuff that we're hearing he can do, then I don't care who he is. I don't care what's going on here. I need him to get back to my house and heal my daughter. So you suddenly then have this incredible moment where maybe this man would have kept a distance from Jesus, but now his own desperate situation forces him to kind of say swallow his pride. Maybe that's too strong, but certainly humble himself before this Galilean rabbi and say, please, I need your help. You have to come and help me. And I do love that. I love that jolt, the demonized man running to Jesus and worshipping him in maybe a small W there. And now Jairus coming to him and begging him, falling at his feet and begging. I love that.
If you've listened to the previous episode, this language of begging appearing once again.
Same language, same word being used all the way through there. Parakaleo. Yeah, it's beautiful.
And so little point of note, what Jairus actually says then. So my little daughter is at the point of death.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me there are two things within this. I think obviously at a micro level, oh my goodness, I'm a dad, I'm a granddad, and my little, you just, you feel the pain of a father, crying little daughter. But then there's this gorgeous contrast, as we're going to lean into later on, when the woman gets healed and Jesus calls her daughter. And I struggling to control myself now. I just don't think that's an accident. Jesus has been summoned to the house of a man whose little daughter is dead or dying at this stage. And then he tenderly ministers to a woman who probably in a long time has never heard someone call her daughter.
Yeah.
Because she's been ostracized and marginalized and has been probably perpetually unclean and has taken a risk to just be in that crowd. And when Jesus discovers who it is, his daughter, I love this. And I think that lovely tension and contrast in the text, the focus goes from a wild man to a little daughter and a daughter. And it's something we've reflected on before, David. I think these gospel writers are just much more clever than we give them credit for sometimes. We just see them as storytellers. And I think, that feels like a deliberate just connecting of these beautiful threads. And I'm very drawn into the desperation of a dad and the tenderness of Jesus to both women in question. Yeah. Lovely.
Yeah. Well, let's just talk a little bit about hermeneutics for a moment, right? And I love the fact that we use the word hermeneutics. It's a Greek word that actually appears in this story. It literally means to translate or to explain. So later on in verse 41, when Jesus says Talitha cum, the Greek literally uses that word, and then it says this is the translation. But hermeneutics has become the term used for how we interpret the Bible. Okay, so something we've said a lot in this podcast has been, the gospel writer seems to be doing this, Mark's doing that, Matthew's doing that. And sometimes some readers might be going, wait a minute, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with you putting this weight on Matthew. Maybe they think, no, these are just the words of Jesus you're talking about. And so it's probably important for us to say, there's the words of Jesus, there's the stories and the happenings, but there's how the gospel writer constructs the stories in terms of, I'm going to put this one here and that one there. And we know the gospel, Luke tells us at the start of Luke, John tells us at the end of John that we're doing this with strategy and with thought. And so the way they line stories up together is important. But Mark 5 is a really great example of what we're talking about here, because the stuff that's happening in Mark 5 that is Jesus talking. And you and I would want to share a sort of interpretive approach to the Bible, that when Jesus talks in the Bible, the gospel writers have done their best to record that accurately, right? So we're not trying to undermine that. And sometimes people might think it sounds like you're saying that when we talk about, oh, look at this word matches to that word and the way Mark's lined it up and everything like that. But you get this double level happening, Mark. So it's a really good example to people as to how the gospel writer is also doing really important theological work while they tell you a story that we would say actually happened, right? Now, if I was a good preacher, John, I would keep this point for the end, but I'm going to say it now to help us hermeneutically. So in the words of Jesus and the words of the story, there's this thread of daughter. My little daughter is at the point of death. Then Jesus turns to the woman and he says, daughter, your faith has made you well. And while he's saying this, the people from the leader's house come and say, your daughter. The beautiful contrast. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Yeah, but your daughter's dead, right? So there's this horrible clash. That's just in the language of the text. So what you're saying is, I think there's a connection there, David. I think that Jairus' language of little daughter, Jesus' language of daughter, it's linking these stories together. Okay? So now, I'd love for our listener to see is that you might think, well, is John pushing it too far there? Well, I'm going to say, no, you're not pushing it too far, because look what Mark then does in the narrative of the story. So this isn't things that people say in the story. This is Mark now painting the picture for you. Notice what he says. There was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. That's commentary from Mark on the story. So this is not reported speech. This is Mark choosing to say, oh, by the way, she was sick for 12 years. And then notice as you look down at verse 42, when the girl is healed, Mark decides to tell you, again, not a necessary part of the story, it's Mark that chooses to tell us, oh, by the way, this girl was 12 years old. Wow. So now you've got, I'm probably overweighing the point here, so forgive me, John, but you've got Jesus drawing connections of daughter and daughter and daughter. And then you've got Mark going, I'm getting on this bandwagon. The woman was sick for 12 years. The daughter is 12 years old. Like, it's as if Mark's going, I need you to see that these two people are worth exactly the same to Jesus. You have the marginalized poor woman and the synagogue leader's daughter. The fact that they are from completely different backgrounds, how does Jesus treat them? Exactly the same. And so Mark he's circled them all in highlighter. He's got arrows pointing down. It's as if he's saying, don't miss what I'm trying to say to you here. They're both daughters. It's awesome, isn't it?
Oh, it's gorgeous. And again, doesn't it show the value? Our listeners will be tired of hearing this from us. But the value of reading sometimes, especially in the Gospels, the sweep of the story. So don't fall into the trap of just isolating these stories as, oh, this is the bit where the woman gets healed and this is the bit where Jesus raises the girl. There is a sweep to these stories that often, not always, of course, but often connect in the most glorious way. And I do love that idea of those lovely connected thoughts that are just showing us. And again, it's, of course, the challenge is not what we don't want. Is, oh, isn't that cool? Isn't that a nice connect? Oh, isn't it great that those words connect? But of course, we're leaning into, but why? Why do they connect? Is what's going on here? And of course, what you've got in Mark 5 is two females. One, it seems a little girl, so maybe pre-bat mitzvah girl. So this is a girl, not a young woman in Jewish culture. And then you've got a woman, and both treated with generosity and care and love and respect, and both swept into this kingdom mandate that Jesus is giving to us. So it's just beautiful. It's not just clever connections. There is a reason for those clever connections that the gospel writers want us to get, because that's who Jesus is.
Yeah, and you've also got both of them with impurities. We've alluded to this already, and not just within the Jewish world. Throughout the ancient Mediterranean, there's this sense that there are purity codes relating to how you deal with the hemorrhage type situation. And it's very vague. What Mark's actually describing here, but you've got this, and you've got a corpse in the nature of a dead girl. So this is some things going on with Mark of pointing together. We're going to talk about this perhaps later on once we've kind of dug in through the text. Jesus' relationship to impurity, which sounds like very ancient language. It might not make a lot of sense to us, but again, this becomes a question of Jesus' relationship to people who would be excluded. Impurity does create periods of distance between you and others in that sort of ancient mindset. If somebody was looking for some homework, Leviticus 15 would be a little bit of homework reading for you, where literally this work through of the kind of impurities that can happen from bodily discharges, some of which are abnormal, some of which are normal. But what they do is that these, when you suffer from some sort of discharge, please forgive me trying to be very cautious with my language, because you may be listening to this in the car with your kids, and you would respect us being careful with how we say things. But when you're dealing with any bodily fluids, for want of a better term, the rules in the Old Testament particularly are actually connected to their ideas of sacredness. So it's not that some of these things are perfectly normal and perfectly regular, but classify you as ritually impure so that you'll keep your distance from the sacred places and the holy places. They're not rules that are designed to exclude permanently. They're rules that are designed to preserve a concept of holiness and a concept of purity that I'm going to suggest in this passage Jesus might be inverting slightly and might be sort of messing around with at some level, doing something unexpected.
Picking up your gorgeous thread on that, isn't it interesting then that in the two women, the little daughter and daughter in these two stories, they both either touch or get touched. So isn't that interesting? Yes. So for example, there's no touching in the first part of Mark 5. So in a Gentile context, that probably wouldn't even be so noticeable if Jesus had have touched the man. And of course he speaks to the demons and the impurity leaves. Here there's touching, so the woman touches the hem of his garment. Him, really, I mean, you can't separate the two things. So she's touching him, and then he takes her hand, the little girl's hand, the little daughter's hand. So isn't that gorgeous? So if you've got this idea of uncleanness is not just unclean per se, but it's an uncleanness to protect sacredness. Here's Jesus, the sacred one, being touched by unclean and touching unclean. I mean that's, and to me that is, whoa, it's just.
Yeah.
I again, hard for us 21st century sort of living in Calgary and North Lincolnshire sort of people to pick that up. But you're going, wow. Again, back to Mark, back to the text, back to stuff they're trying to say. There's got to be a coincidence, or there's got to be not a coincidence that two potentially unclean contexts are seen with touching going on. And Jesus remains sacred.
Yes.
And they become clean. So I'm sorry, I'm getting very emotional. I'm getting more emotional in my old age now. I am so sorry.
I think you're picking up on exactly the sort of things that we want to be picking up in this story. That generally speaking, when you are ritually impure, let's use a very up to the moment word. What happens to a person when they are encountering a moment of ritual impurity? Now, let me just be really clear on this. Ritual impurity doesn't mean you've sinned, right? It just is something has happened that means you just need to go through a period of purification or a period of waiting, and you go into quarantine. There's a word from the 21st century for us. So you would sort of quarantine yourself away from folks for a little while. Now, I think it's important that when we talk about ritual impurity as well, that we always track that. We're not saying this person's dirty, right? It's not that they're not washing. There's in our minds, purity and cleanliness are kind of the same thing, but in the ancient world, this is not about cleanliness. This is about religious and ritual purity in that sense. And so one of the things that's important to note is that when you are ritually impure, there basically is a sense that you are infectious, right? And therefore everything, I'm tempted to riff too much on COVID-related things here, John. Like, what is the R number of ritual impurity or something like that? But if you are ritually impure, anything you touch has the potential to be ritually impure as well. And there's even discussion within the Jewish literature about what then happens to the people who then touch that stuff. Right? So, and in some cases, there's this perception that it really is infectious. So the ritually impure person touches the chair, and then somebody else touches the chair, they're now impure. So there's kind of high infectiousness potential about ritual impurity. For this woman, the nature of her illness and sickness is that she will have been ritually impure for 12 years. Wow. So this means it's highly unlikely she's gone to the synagogue. She won't have taken part in any sacred practices. She will not be under Jewish law allowed to have children during this time. There's preventions between what her husband and hers relationships can be. If she has children already, the text doesn't tell us this, but if she has children, her inability to touch them. Imagine, like, we don't have this in the text, but if she does have children and she's not hugged them for 12 years, if she has a husband, she's not been with him for 12 years, she is living an isolated life unless somebody is willing to accept the ritual impurity of being with her, right, and being around her and being her friend. So there's, and then contrasting this, you have Jairus' daughter, who is dead, which also is, I can't say this without sounding like I'm trying to be ridiculous and facetious, but also has completely cut you off from people. But there's a sense in which this woman, her womb is dead at some level because something's very catastrophically wrong that she's going to be prevented from having children. At some level, her existence is towards dead because she's completely cut off from relationship and interaction with people. So again, you see these two stories, they're kind of in the same space with each other. And the fascinating thing, however, is that she reaches out and touches Jesus, which is really brave because technically speaking, that should cause Jesus to become impure. Similarly, when Jesus reaches out and touches Jairus' daughter's hand, Jesus should become impure. Of course, the text tells us a different story. It's so good. I mean, there's very little to add to that, David, in terms of your summary. I think that's the benefit of slowing this story down, connecting it to its culture, to the moment that it lives in. And this is not always easy for us in the 21st century. We need to do a bit of time travel and detective work, but it's worth the effort because then it takes these stories to a whole dynamic new level. That this isn't just a random thing, but something powerful is being communicated about who Jesus is. And he is providing wholeness, can I say, in the proper sense of the word, purity. And we're nowhere near a temple. We're nowhere near a synagogue. We're nowhere. He is taking on the impurity of these two moments and bringing
wholeness and life, just as he did to the man in the Gerasenes. He drove out the spirits that were impure in him. Now the impurity leaves these two contexts in both very different ways, but very tender. Very tender. If Mark 5 begins with something that feels dynamically combative, then the next two stories feel dramatically compassionate and tender. And it shows, doesn't it show again Jesus shifting? He can be this sort of warrior driving evil away, and yet he can be this brother, this husband-like person, this father-esque person. He's taking on the context of speaking to a woman broken and saying daughter, almost a father language to her, which would have been so redemptive. And then, of course, the tenderness of taking the little girl by the hand. Notice he doesn't call her little daughter, because that's not his language, but he calls her little girl. I love that. And again, the tenderness of that little girl rise up. So, it's beautiful, David. It's so good.
I think it's worth just a little moment around this touch of Jesus as well, from the woman with the bleeding, the hemorrhages. She says, if I but touch his clothes. It's interesting that we noticed it in the last episode. It was just kind of alluded to quickly, but when you're over in the end of Mark chapter 6, as stories of Jesus are sort of spreading, you get this sense that people are begging that they might even come and touch the fringe of his clothes. Now, I don't know what your sort of connection with this, but I've seen some people, writers over the years, try and connect this to a little bit of messianic prophecies. I don't know if you've encountered this idea in Malachi chapter 4 and verse 2, that the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his wings. And a few people have noticed that in the Hebrew of Malachi chapter 2, there's Malachi chapter 4, verse 2. The word is kanaf, right, which is used to describe wings. But kanaf is a word to describe garments, and sometimes the edge of garments. And so some people have wondered, it's just a kind of thinking out loud moment, John, but some people have wondered whether there's something potentially going on here, that the woman sort of channeling a little bit of her messianic hope, that if this man is the Messiah, then is healing in his kanaf, is healing in his wings or garments. And therefore, if I can just touch his garments, then I will be healed. And I know now it's not, Mark doesn't draw the connection explicitly there, but it's just one to think about. I don't know, have you encountered this? Do you have thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's a very Jewish way of thinking, really. So I think in terms of the world of Jesus, they would have looked for these connectors. Some of these connectors would have been significant. Things that we would just regard as coincidence may be regarded as much more than that. And this sort of sense of the touchability of Jesus, the fact that he becomes known as one who touches and is touched. And again, we've sort of lent into that. You've already referenced there at the end of chapter 6, they begged him to let him touch even the edge of it, and all who touched him were healed. And it's just, so I think again, part of the incarnation is allowing humanity to get close enough to touch who he is and be touched by him. And that Malachi allusion, why not? I mean, some may think that is a stretch. Well, it's fair enough. If you're willing to make the connection between that sense of his skirts or his garment or his wings, actually, it's there. Is it this is the woman recognizing something, and without articulating explicitly her conviction that he is the Messiah, is she by her action articulating something? I mean, she wouldn't be alone in the Gospels for doing that. There were people who did certain things because they believed certain things or they hoped for certain things. And why this woman and not all the other people who touched him that day? You know, why is this woman highlighted in the context? I think it's because she explicitly says, if I can just touch the edge of his garment, and I think there could be allusion to that glorious idea that he has risen with healing in his garments or in his wings. Absolutely. Why not? Why not?
Even that then relates to a fascinating aspect of the story, doesn't it? Because Jesus doesn't seem to have, goodness, and you want to tread carefully to not say what your people might find is the wrong thing to say about Jesus, but Jesus appears to have had no control over this miracle. It feels
incredible.
It has been automatic, hasn't it? That somehow, I mean, Jesus says your faith has saved you, which is interesting. Perhaps we need to think a little bit about that language at one level as well. But Jesus is aware of the healing after the healing has happened. It's quite remarkable, John.
It is. It's totally incredible. And I think the implication is something is drawn from him by her. So it's not like he is explicitly thinking, right, there's a woman here, I need to sort this out. It's her faith, her action towards him draws something from him, which is absolutely beautiful and also quite mysterious, isn't it? It's what's going on here. And even Jesus, I mean, the reaction of the disciples is quite humorous, isn't it? Jesus said, who touched, when he asked this sort of question, who actually touched me, he says, having known in himself that power came out of him, has gone forth from him. And he turns and says, who touched me? I love that. And of course the disciples go, what? What do you mean? There's, but then doesn't it show us again and again? I suppose if we're trying to draw lessons from this, there's touching and there's touching. So there is a touching of faith, whatever we mean by that. And then there is the rubbing up against the bumping into the hustle and the bustle. But something's going on here that draws God, that draws God's power. And I love that. Something in the heart of this woman draws the power of God to her.
And at the same time, that there's also that kind of mark and reversal idea going on, that the unclean, the impure person touches things and they become automatically impure, but Jesus touches things and they become automatically pure. They become automatically clean again. It's quite beautiful. It's quite fascinating, is it? Again, I've mentioned it already, but there's a beautiful little line in Thiessen's book on the forces of death that he just says, the story of the hemorrhaging woman gives readers the impression that Jesus is innately, or one could say ontologically, opposed to ritual impurity, and that his body, like a force of nature, inevitably will destroy impurity's sources. I love that quote. This idea that Jesus might innately, like something in his being, just reacts against the forces of impurity. Like what a brilliant thought.
Fantastic.
That what you're seeing in Jesus isn't. Well, and let me not misquote. It's not that we're saying Jesus isn't also consciously trying to eradicate the forces of impurity and evil, but it's so much who he is that in this situation, it's even happening without his conscious awareness.
Yes.
Like it's awesome, isn't it? It's
awesome. And I love the humanity of the moment in verse 32 as he was looking around to see the person who had done this. I mean, there is a glorious, mysterious, paradoxical moment here of the incarnation, isn't it? So, there would be a view that Jesus is always aware, always in control, knows everything, knows everyone because he is God. And here's a beautiful sort of human moment. And the tension, power has just left him that's healed this woman. So that's a incredible, wow moment. And yet he's going, hold on, I need to locate the person who did this. Isn't that a beautiful paradox? Now, I know that messes with our head a little bit, but I like that. I like the sort of messiness of that. I think there's a grace in that messiness that sort of goes, well, why didn't Jesus just knew who it was, and why didn't Jesus just spot her before she even got there? And you get this impression, please, listeners, don't throw anything now at your laptop or your phone, but that Jesus didn't quite know what was about to happen. And I love that. I love this sort of sense of humanity here, which draws us into the story even more. And doesn't it feel then like his reaction to her feels really then tender and natural, rather than feeling, oh, well, I knew this was going to happen. Here's my answer. It's like a reaction to her. And I love that sense of reaction to the woman.
And that's where the parallels work really well, isn't it? You've got a miracle story within a miracle story. So the story begins as the story of the healing of Jairus' daughter, but now you get this woman in the middle of it presented as an interruption. And there's even an element of it which kind of tries to imply that the slowing down to deal with this lady may have caused problems in getting to Jairus' house on time. It's not explicit, but there's this sense of that.
Definitely.
Whereby then Jesus' final comment in this part of the story, where the woman fades out of the story now, is, daughter, your faith has made you well. So the final comment is that, what is this story? It's a story of Jesus on his way to heal a daughter. Well, if Jesus is in the business of healing daughters, of course he's going to stop on the way to heal this daughter. And in case anybody misses that, Jesus is going to call her daughter. And then the fact that then the intro into the next phase of the story is now, but your daughter, Jairus, your daughter is dead. This daughter is healed, but your daughter is dead. So it's brilliant the way it all holds together, isn't it?
Do you know, David, I love your language of interruption, because I think it adds weight to the magnificence of the story of the healing of this woman, because it does feel a little bit like, okay, we're on the way to the main event and you sort of got in the way. And doesn't it sweep her up? She has been out of the way. She has been excluded. She has been on the fringe. And even her healing feels like it was an interruption. And yet Jesus makes it a main event. He stops. Isn't it gorgeous? It says at verse 33, frightened and trembling, knowing what had been done to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And then he said, now, in order for that to happen, in order for her to fall down in front of him, for him to speak tenderly, he has to stop the procession. So what seems to have been an interruption now becomes the main event. And he, even though he's got Jairus' daughter in the background, and all of that's kicking off, he slows the whole thing down. And I love the fact that Jesus stops the parade for this woman. The woman who has been ignored for 12 years. Completely ignored. And now everybody's looking at her. And I just find that his ability to go, right, everybody stop. And that's just sort this situation out. The faith of you has healed you. Oh my goodness. It's just, this woman must have felt really rubbish about herself. And yet what does Jesus say?
Yes.
The faith of you has healed you. My goodness. Something in you, he's saying, has called God out of me to heal you. Yeah, what an affirmation that is. Not just that she is daughter, but something in her sort of called God to her. Wow, come on. Yeah. It's just, and David, I love the sort of triple emphasis in 34. There seems to be, to me, I don't know if you can help me further with this, but there seems to be a triple emphasis of sort of wholeness thinking in 34. Jesus says, the faith of you has healed you. So you've got a beautiful idea of healing, which Zozo can point to the idea of wholeness. And then he says, go in peace, Irene, which of course relates usually to shalom, the wholeness idea, and be sound from your affliction. I guess it's, and there seems to be almost a triple lean into there of the woman hasn't been complete for 12 years. And Jesus, in using three different words, healed, peace, and sound, leans into now you're whole. You're whole in that you can return to community. You're whole in that you are at peace at mind, and you're whole in that you're healed. Feels like a triple emphasis on the wholeness there.
So you've got this. You've got this first statement. Your faith has, as you said, it's the Greek word sozo, which is also used of salvation. So there's something deep going on there. It's perfect tense in the Greek, so it's perfected. Yeah. Your faith has healed you, so you are healed. And then you get these two imperatives. Go. It's imperative, isn't it? Go in peace. Actually, you can head off into this now because it's perfected. This healing is, so you can depart. There's nothing else for you to do. And be well, like be healthy is another way to translate it. Be well or healthy from what it was that was inflicting your disease. So generally, what happens within Greek language is when you have this sort of range of emphatic statements, they basically build the intensity. So this woman is completely sorted out. Within the Jewish context, the idea of peace and shalom and wholeness is there. So go in wholeness, go in completeness. It is, John, it is beautiful. It's
gorgeous.
It's quite something. And so then we transition over to this, then the dark side of the story that actually it turns out that Jairus' daughter has died in the process of this. And you hear this sort of fatalism of, so why trouble the teacher anymore? So you go from the heights of, wow, Jesus' involuntary action has healed this woman, and down to now, well, we should probably just end the story here because there's no hope.
Yes. It is a jolt, isn't it? It's a big, like a crunching gear change right in the middle of the story. I mean, verse 34, it's almost like the crowd is hushed. We are hearing these amazing words. The woman is affirmed and transformed. We are drawn into the story. Even as I've heard it read today again, my emotions have been stirred again. And then suddenly, while he was still speaking, wow. In the process of speaking to the daughter, he gets the news about the other daughter.
Yes.
It's a jolt, isn't it? Yeah. It's a shock. Yeah. And isn't that life, David? Like, isn't that life? You can have a sublime experience with Jesus, and in the very next minute, it's like the reality of planet broken and sad and disappointed and whatever grabs us, and we are confronted with reality. It's like the disciples up the mount of what we sometimes call the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. They see Jesus transfigured. They come down. What are they confronted with? This man whose son is so demonized that the demon tries to throw him in the fire, and the disciples couldn't set him free. So you go from this sublime, let's build 3 tents for Moses, Elijah, and you, Jesus. Let's live here forever. And then you come down the hill and you go, confronted with grungy reality. Isn't that verse 34, 35? Isn't that our lives? Isn't it like sublime, ridiculous, like glorious, painful, blessed, and broken? It's a real, it's one verse, and it sort of summarizes so much of our experience in life, 34 to 35. Wow, what a jolt.
No, you're absolutely right. But then you get Jesus' earwigging on their conversation. I love that, overhearing what they said. And so this little line here in verse 36 is just, the simplicity of it is so nice. It's only 4 words in the Greek, and a lot of the English translations try and preserve its shortness, but it's kind of hard in English to say the same thing so shortly. But don't fear, only believe. And so grammatically, this little passage is interesting because the way that it's formed, the language of the way that the grammar works of don't fear is a sort of emphasis around stop an action that's in progress. So it's not like Jesus is saying to him, don't start being afraid, right? He's actually aware of the fact you are afraid. And I'm encouraging you to stop being afraid, but then to continue. The grammar then suggests it's continue trusting or continue believing. So it's like you've started the journey, you're afraid for your daughter's life, but you're trusting in Jesus. And Jesus now invites him, well, what about if we're going to go on, if you stop the fear bit and continue in the trust bit? Because if you let the fear run you at this point, you're going to stop bothering Jesus. You're going to go, yeah, actually, you're right. We should just stop bothering Jesus. But Jesus just doesn't want that to happen. It's awesome, isn't it? Keep saying it's awesome in this episode, but it really is awesome.
It is awesome. It is, and that's a proper use of the word too. It is truly awesome. And isn't it beautiful that he does speak that directly to Jairus? I mean, it's a bit impersonal, the ruler of the synagogue, but he's speaking to Jairus, because Jairus is the boss now. Whatever Jairus calls next is going to happen. If Jairus says it's done, it's over, forget it. But of course, remember, right? So let's just pause a little bit between 34 and 35. Again, Jairus has just witnessed the healing of this other daughter. It's one of the little facts we do tend to forget, don't we? It's like he's not in the scene. He's in the scene, then he's out of the scene, then he's in the scene. But of course, he's there the whole time. He is literally, if we're reading this properly, he's the one leading Jesus to his home when Jesus gets interrupted. Therefore, he has potentially got a front row seat on the healing of this woman. And therefore, maybe we hear Jesus. We've reflected on this before about Jesus's tone, right? So, if Jairus has been standing right there all that time, seeing this woman healed, then maybe when he says to Jairus in the context of this, "Don't fear, only believe," there's a tonation here of Jairus. Jairus, look at me. Look at me. Look what's just happened. Now don't listen to them. Listen to me. Don't fear. Stop fear. And what a moment. He's just potentially witnessed the healing of this woman, and now he's being confronted with the reality that his daughter is dead, and he now has a dramatic choice to make. Either to lead the procession on or go, nah, it's all over. Leave it. And wow, hey, I want to lean into the tone of Jesus there. I'm wanting to hear a tender tone, right? So you've got voices all around Jairus happening right now, and I'm wanting, here's what I'm wanting to imagine. Jesus is looking straight at Jairus, and he's saying to Jairus, look at me, look at me. Don't listen to them. Look at me. Stop fearing. Believe me. Believe me. I'm the one that can do this. I've just done it. I can do this for your daughter. And in the midst of the chaos, I wanna believe that that's a deeply intimate face-to-face moment for Jairus.
Yeah.
And I think that's the moment he goes, okay, let's do this. Let's do this.
Yeah, it's great. It really is. There's something, the humanity of the whole story is quite profound, isn't it? That everybody is humanized in really important ways. The only exception perhaps being the crowd at Jairus' house. One of my favorite bits of the story as well.
Absolutely.
She's not dead but sleeping. So they all laughed at him and he put them all outside. Well, if you're going to laugh, you don't get to be part of this.
Get out. Yeah. But doesn't it show then the contrast of context that the group that has moved with Jesus towards Jairus' daughter, they're not laughing. Nobody with him is laughing when he says this, because, hey, if you'd have just seen what we've just seen, then actually you wouldn't be laughing. They're laughing because they're hearing these words out of all sense. And to be fair to them, if some Galilean rabbi showed up at the house and said she's just sleeping, I mean, people would laugh, wouldn't they? They'd think he was bonkers. But they laugh because they're out of context, and it's so, again, so important that we do see the world as we are, not as it is sometimes. And again, we're judging from where we stand, not from what actually is reality. So it's a funny moment, and also quite a sobering moment too.
It really is. Even this sort of sense of when she's raised from the dead, give her something to eat. I just love. I don't hear it a lot made of it, John, but there's something beautiful about Jesus. He's just concerned, just his care and concern, just for something so practical and small. Yeah, just give her something to eat. You get this little insight into the compassion of Jesus. If you haven't found it in this passage so far, here it is in the final words of the chapter. It's just that Jesus even cares that this person who has just died and been raised to life just needs some practicalities like a little bit of food.
That's gorgeous. It is. It's lovely. It's lovely. And of course, in context, she wouldn't have just been given a snack. That would have maybe been the cue for, hey, let's have a feast. Let's celebrate. It's back to our language of party again. So you've just had all the weeping, the commotion, the professional mourners are now in. It's all going on. Jesus kicks all of that out, and by signaling, let's give her something to eat. Maybe that's a signal for, right, let's have a feast. Let's enjoy this. Let's celebrate the fact she was dead and now she's alive. And of course, we're given no insight into that, only that they were astonished. But you've got to if I was Jairus' daughter, I'd be saying, Jesus, hang around. We're going to have dinner. Let's do this together. We want you to enjoy our hospitality within it. No, it's just beautiful. And again, the compassion of give her something to eat just flows out of, little girl, I say to you, get up. It's just, he's not even speaking to the death. He's not speaking, he just speaks to the child. And as if wakening her from sleep, she just gets up. And there are scenes in the Gospels where I would love, if there's a heaven flicks when we get to heaven and we can go to a library and sort of just like get a download. This would be one of the stories where you go, I'd love to see the reaction of the group and how people respond to that. David, can I ask you one question as around this? There's an astonishing moment right at the end of chapter 5. And it says in verse 43, he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. So we've got this beautiful give her something to eat moment. Let's celebrate. So we've been talking about all these gorgeous connectors and contrasts in Mark 5. And of course, this is a bit of a contrast to the end of our first episode in Mark 5, where at the end, literally, it says, so the man went away and began to tell or proclaim, how much Jesus had done for him. The woman, the daughter that's been healed in the story, I mean, that's front and center now. That's a public miracle. There's no hiding that. And yet we've got this little moment where he's saying to them, don't tell anyone about this. What sort of reflection would you have around what might be, because we're trying to lean into what's going on here in terms of meaning. What might be nuanced into this?
There's a lot of discussion about this amongst scholarship over the years, and this has become known as the motif of the messianic secret, that Jesus seems to want to not make a big deal of certain things. I have a couple of sort of places that I stand on it. There's a lot of people that are infinitely smarter than me that can't quite decide what to make of this, because it's a theme that appears throughout Mark quite regularly. Jesus does something and don't tell anybody about it. Don't tell anybody about it. And then there's even a brilliant line where it's like, the more Jesus told them not to tell anyone, the more everybody talked about it. So people weren't very obedient on this front. Interestingly, of course, in the first half in Mark 5, he is told, as you say, to go and preach about it, and this woman's not told. So here, my take on it is simply this. I think you see this in a few places in the Gospels. I think that Jesus knows that there is a bit of a campaign to define what Messiah is. And I think that Jesus wants to show, and we've talked about it already in this season, that Peter's unhappy with Jesus' take on what it means to be the Messiah. In John, they decide that if Jesus is the Messiah, they're going to make him king by force, and Jesus has to get out of that sort of space. So I think that when you come to be the Messiah as Jesus did, but you're going to be a Messiah that's different from what everybody expected, I think it's very important that you try to avoid the popularity quest, the journey of celebrity almost. So I think there's some fascinating little inputs potentially there as to why Jesus doesn't do what we would perhaps do in the modern Western context, which is let's hold a rally and really let everybody know about this. It seems like Jesus is concerned that people will draw the right and wrong conclusions here in that. But then there's another thing that Mark does, which I just want to mention, which I've always been fascinated by, that consistently throughout the gospel, people are told, please don't tell anybody about this. Until you get to the very end of Mark's gospel in chapter 16 and verse 8, you get this little moment where, now, worth mentioning as well that in the earliest editions of Mark's Gospel that we have, Mark 16 verse 8 is the end of Mark's Gospel. And at some point later in Christian tradition, some scribes added little conclusions because 16 verse 8 felt very stark as an ending. I'm relatively confident in my own research that 16 verse 8 is the original ending, and what you get beyond that is a postscript that's been added later. So what's interesting then is that the resurrection has just happened, and the young man says to these disciples, he says, so go, says to these women who are there, go and proclaim. They're actually told, go and tell. And the final words of Mark's gospel is, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So you have this interesting little discipleship motif that throughout Jesus says, don't tell anybody about this just yet. Don't tell anybody this. And people completely ignore him. And they're going out and they're announcing about Jesus. And then you get Jesus saying, well, the message from Jesus is go and proclaim. And fear takes over a little bit. Now, and I'm going to tread carefully, is what I'm saying. Clearly, that's not entirely true. Clearly, they did say something to someone, right? Because we know the story. The story's been shared. And I almost am tempted to think it's Mark, just this final little, this is how I've read it. It's a challenge. It's Mark's final challenge to you as a reader. Okay. You have now understood the Messiah. You've seen the Son of God clearly. You've understood the way of the cross. So now you can go and talk about it. Don't go and talk about Jesus when it's just, and again, forgive me, when it just appears like you're interested in magic tricks, right? Yeah. Don't go and talk about simply the Jesus of the miracles or the Jesus of the calmings of the storm. You have to get through the cross and resurrection and now go and talk about this Jesus, because we're not calling people to a show. We're calling people to a new kingdom. So for me, that's how I've tried to sort of sit with this strange theme throughout the Gospels. Does that help, John?
Oh, that's very helpful. I think it's very helpful for our listeners who are trying to, if we've been encouraging them to read Mark 5 as a flow, there seems to be a bit of go and tell everybody in your hometown what Jesus has done in a Decapolis setting, but here in a Jewish setting, be a bit more careful. And is there an explanation for that? And it seems that Jesus is less, I was going to use the phrase less stressed, but that might offend people. Jesus is less concerned of words spreading about him in a Gentile context and certain words spreading in a Jewish context. And also, isn't it fascinating, again, something you said, which I thought was very, very helpful, that the reaction of the man who has been set free from the demons, he clearly has been transformed, not just in his body, but in his thinking. He is a disciple, so he will be spreading who Jesus is, not simply what Jesus did. And it's moving, I suppose it's the challenge of moving the crowd beyond the miracles into the truth of who he is. And then we understand the miracles properly. Whereas if we only are drawn to Jesus purely because of the miracles, we are in danger of missing who he is. And I think as you've lent into, that could be what Mark is helping us with. So it's a beautiful thought. Thanks, David. Wonderful.
Okay, so that's it for our two texts this week. Thanks so much for listening as we talked our way through Mark chapter 5. We really hope that you enjoyed it. If you'd like to get in touch with either of us about something we said in this episode, you can reach out to us at podcast@twotext.com or by liking and following the Two Text podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. If you did enjoy this episode, then please leave us a review or comment where you're listening from. And if you really, really enjoyed the episode, then please share it with someone else. Don't forget you can listen to all our podcasts at www.twotexts.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. But that's it for this episode. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another episode. But until then, goodbye.